The Bogosity Podcast, early and ad-free. Become a subscriber at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Discord. Use the links at donate.bogosity.tv.
Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of May 19, 2024, the podcast that skips the light fandango. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's tackify the news of the bogus. It's been a while since we've covered an update in the Kim.com saga, but that's because it's been a while since anything happened. It's kind of been stuck on hold for something like 8 years, stuck in a legal limbo. If you recall, he was raided and charged with creating Mega Upload, the first cloud service. Seriously, they call it a pirate file sharing site, but I've challenged people over the years to name one functional difference between Mega Upload and Dropbox, and they can't do it. But that didn't stop the U.S. from trying to have .com extradited to the U.S. for facilitating copyright by others, even though .com isn't a U.S. citizen, has never set foot in the U.S., never ran a business in the U.S., and there's no such thing as secondary criminal copyright infringement to begin with. We've covered the corruption that the New Zealand authorities have been engaging in to have him extradited, attempts which for years have been unsuccessful. All that seems to be changing. The other Mega Upload coders, Matthias Ortman and Bram van der Kolk, pled guilty and took sentences of 2.5 years, apparently in exchange for what Kim.com calls false confessions to be used against him. Apparently, the Biden administration, being firmly in the back pocket of Hollywood, has been urging New Zealand to move things forward, including secret orders that could result in a new raid and revocation of his bail. It's been 12 years since Mega Upload was shut down, and this podcast has been here to cover all of it. .com, Ortman, and van der Kolk fought back for something like a decade. But the latter two did something they all vowed never to do: compromise. It's hard to blame them. They've faced a decade of anxiety and uncertainty, being charged with crimes that could get them 186 years in prison. And the deal just gets them 2.5, as long as they testify against .com. Yeah, still trying to figure out how that's not witness tampering. But this is what prosecutors do, and New Zealand is no exception. They pile on every single little count they can and get the potential offense as high as they can, in this case 186 years for making a cloud service. To then be sentenced to just 30 months speaks of what we've always said about prosecutors. Either they're so corrupt that they'll let horrible criminals off lightly to get what they want, or they're so corrupt they'll deliberately charge them with offenses they know are false just to extort them into doing what they want. Either way, there's no way around the corruption. .com wrote, I hear that my co-defendants in the Mega Upload case have recently been released after 10 months in what U.S. prisoners would consider a New Zealand wellness retreat. They were originally charged with 186 years by the U.S. DOJ for the so-called mega conspiracy and got off with a 99.5% discount in exchange for false confessions. Obviously, they just wanted to move on with their lives after 10 years on bail. No doubt the U.S. DOJ and New Zealand police will have milked my former friends and partners for every bit of criminal fantasy that they could extract. Before the national government and their justice minister decide how to extradite me, they will need some new bad optics. Kim.com bad man. The US DOJ is currently working on delivering that to the national government of New Zealand, and I'm sure we will learn about fantastic new tales before the minister makes his extradition decision. And they can easily do it too, with everything Biden has been doing to weaponize the Justice Department. Remember when I told you this kind of thing would go way beyond Donald Trump? Of course, what they're in for now is potentially another 5 years worth of court fights where the New Zealand government will have to explain how .com committed, in their words, maliciousness and unlawfulness. .com wrote, "These are real proceedings with Discovery. We intend to get deep into the machinations of what really happened, and we are well prepared. No doubt the Attorney General will try to get this in front of selected judges like they did before. There's a trail of promotions and titles for those who ruled against us in the past, but it will only add more stains to the New Zealand judiciary if reasonable requests for discovery are declined and approval for unreasonable redactions and secrecy is granted. One thing is sure, we will fight to the very end. If I am eventually extradited to the United States, it will happen at a great cost to New Zealand, something I'm sure the perpetrators who have subverted the New Zealand law for the U.S. government will care little about. Of course, as we covered, this case has had a taint about it for years. Most recently, U.S. District Court Judge Liam O'Grady had to be replaced in the civil cases against .com in the United States, and he just recused himself from the criminal case too. Turns out, Judge O'Grady, who was handpicked by the DOJ to destroy Mega Upload in an ex parte proceeding, was previously a lawyer for Disney and actively owned stock in Disney while presiding over the case. But now, just over the past month, the DOJ filed ex parte motions under seal asking the court to issue orders in secret without .com's legal team being given any chance to respond or even be present. And New Zealand will likely kowtow, as their new Attorney General, Judith Collins, years ago said openly in Parliament, quote, "I hope that Kim.com will soon be extradited." .com wrote, "Whatever this new action by the U.S. DOJ is, it will be malicious, dirty, and without substance. I have done nothing wrong. They want to silence me and take my freedom away. I'm expecting another raid, seizure of my devices, and arrest with the goal to get my bail revoked and to stop me from being so successfully loud about the corruption that has ruined the United States and turned New Zealand into a nation that is subverting its own laws to please their U.S. masters. It won't be long until they take action. The U.S. judge will give the DOJ what they are asking for, and the New Zealand government is ready to act for the evildoers who want to destroy me." Kim.com, Roger Ver, all of this is just the beginning, and we've got another one coming up in the next segment. If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odysee.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odysee is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you create at Odysee to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency, without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odysee.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. Yes, Europe is in no way immune to what we just discussed. If anything, they're far worse, being unconstrained by anything resembling a Bill of Rights with any sort of teeth to it. A Dutch court just sentenced one of the founders of Tornado Cash to 64 months in prison. They redacted the name of the defendant, but it's well known that Russian national Alexei Pertsev has been awaiting trial in the Netherlands on money laundering charges. He was arrested in August of 2022 after the Lazarus Group cashed out of their proceeds. The U.S. Treasury Department said the service was responsible for giving them the tools to do it. The ruling said, quote, "The defendant declared that it was never his intention to break the law or to facilitate criminal activities. With Tornado Cash, he wanted to offer a legitimate solution for a growing need for privacy in the crypto community. According to him, it is up to the users not to abuse Tornado Cash." Which is how it should be, but the court didn't see it that way, quote, "Tornado Cash does not pose any barrier for people with criminal assets who want to launder them. That is why the court regards the defendant guilty of the money laundering activities as charged. And what was it they did? They allowed a centralized crypto mixer which greatly enhances privacy and fungibility, and they failed to implement KYC and AML programs required by U.S. federal law, which is that part where you have to send them a picture of you holding your driver's license or something like that. In other words, they just made privacy illegal. The only way for them to act in accordance with the law is to actively violate the privacy of their users. They even said outright that the service guaranteed, quote, maximum anonymity and optimal concealment techniques without doing anything to, quote, make identification, control, or investigation possible. Well, other than the very possible technique of using actual detective work, we've also been covering how that's rapidly become a lost art as police and investigators rely on the destruction of privacy and anonymity as a cheap substitute. The U.S. Department of Justice indicted two other founders, Roman Storm and Roman Semenov, with conspiracy to commit money laundering, conspiracy to commit sanctions violations, and conspiracy to operate an unlicensed money transmitting business. It's like the culmination of every bit of the Biden injustice plan we've seen building up since he took office. This has to stop, or no one will even be able to make a move without government watching them. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.pagosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.pagosity.tv. So we've been covering the evidence that's been coming out more and more of thousands of fraudulent votes in several swing states from the 2020 election, more than enough to have made the difference in the presidential race. Now we have confirmation of another 3,000 in Georgia, on top of all the other ones we've covered, which include 20,000 ballots with no source tabulator showing where they came from, over 17,000 ballots with no ballot images required for tabulation, and another 17,000 unsourced votes found after certification. In a state where the presidential candidates were separated by less than 12,000 votes. Fulton County was just given a reprimand by the Georgia State Election Board for double counting over 3,000 ballots during a recount of the 2020 presidential election. But only a reprimand. Not that they're going to do anything about it or try to make sure it doesn't happen again. Joe Rossi, the voter who filed the complaint against Fulton County, said to the board,
"It has now been factually proven that both the hand audit, this is really, really important, and the certified machine count, yes, the certified count, have both been found to be in violation of Georgia election law. Based on these findings, to those that have fought factually, respectfully, and relentlessly, I'll close with one word: vindicated."
Even after all of that, they're still claiming there was no fraud in the 2020 election. Charlene McGowan, General Counsel for the Secretary of State, said,
Fulton County used improper procedures during the recount of the presidential contest in 2020. The investigation also shows that there are some duplicative ballot images in the ballot images that Fulton County provided. And this suggests that some ballots may have been scanned more than once. But what cannot be decided conclusively or confirmed conclusively is whether or not those duplicative ballot images were included in the count.
But the only criteria that has ever been required for overturning an election is simply that the ballots were called into question, not proven to be fraudulent, which is usually impossible. So even after they acknowledge directly votes that are absolutely called into question, they still insist that the results of the presidential election are confirmed as valid. Unbelievable. And that's just of the ones they'll let people see. They denied investigation over the fact that over 380,000 ballot images from the machine count were unavailable. Take a listen.
Does the investigation confirm that there are missing ballot images?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know why 380,761 ballot images from Election Day machine count are not available?
We subpoenaed Fulton County for all of their ballot images. We received approximately 518,000 ballot images.
From Election Day?
Those are for the recount.
Those are from the recount. But we have no ballot images for 380,761 ballots from Election Day, correct?
What was subpoenaed was the ballot images for the recount because that's what this case was about, not the Election Day.
Does Fulton County know why there are not 380,761 ballot images from Election Day?
As with the investigators, we have not been apprised of this allegation. This is the first time hearing about it. I have no idea what the basis of that allegation is, and so we would have to we can't answer that.
Sorry, the audio was so bad the AI had a problem enhancing it. The transcript is correct, though. The state says it cannot conclusively confirm the ballots were counted, but that doesn't matter. They can't confirm that they weren't, and that calls the ballots into question. Again, that's all that is needed. They're ignoring that very important legal precedent, and the only consequence they faced was a slap on the wrist. Nothing to stop them from behaving like this again. Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-age children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. And now it's time to achromatize this week's biggest bogon emitter. If you ever want to write an instruction manual on how to completely botch a criminal trial, just get all the deets on Alvin Bragg's criminal prosecution of Donald Trump in New York. This is the one where he's accused of paying hush money to porn star Stormy Daniels. Quick recap. Trump allegedly slept with Stormy, which isn't a crime. He engaged in a legal settlement with her where he would pay her $130,000 in exchange for her signing an NDA, which also isn't a crime. He repaid his lawyer, Michael Cohen, which also isn't illegal. He wrote the payment down as legal services. Bragg is claiming that this is a fraudulent business entry, even though it was paid to a lawyer for a legal settlement regarding an NDA, which is a legal document. Even if that were true, it's a misdemeanor and the statute of limitations would have run out years ago. So to make it a crime, it has to have been done in furtherance of another crime. What is that crime? We haven't really been told. Basically, something election interference, because it was made in 2016 when Trump was running for president, and he didn't want it getting out before the election. Or he didn't want Melania to find out, but I guess that's just crazy talk. Anyway, Stormy took the stand and proceeded to blow the entire prosecution. You know what I mean. She testified to the very affair she spent something like a decade denying ever happened, long before the NDA. Most of her testimony was completely irrelevant details about the sexual relationship. Note that whether or not the sex even happened is irrelevant, just that he paid her not to say they did. But she spent most of her time on the stand going into very salacious details about the affair, including some very cartoonish descriptions of what Trump said and did that seemed made up by, well, a maker of bad porno movies. She even tried to hashtag Me Too it long after that went out of vogue, intimating that she had been drugged and saying she blacked out, among other details. Things she had never said before and even explicitly denied. It had no probative value whatsoever. It was all there to prejudice the already biased Manhattan jury. She also apparently tried winning over the jury by cracking jokes, but absolutely nobody laughed. That's even the opinion of CNN. Sadly, there are no cameras allowed in the courtroom, but if you want to know how it all went, Joe Neerman of Good Logic brought on some guests to do a read-through of the official court transcript of her testimony, especially a hilarious depiction of Stormy herself by Sean Martin of Potentially Criminal. Link is in the show notes. So after that, Bragg had to do damage control. He called up paralegal Jaden Jarmel Schneider to testify about the communications between Michael Cohen and Stormy's lawyer Keith Davidson. It featured a lot of text messages designed to show the deal coming together in October just before the election. But when it came time for cross, defense attorney Emile Beauvais got her to admit that they deleted 3 pages of phone calls between the two. Destruction of evidence. That's a felony. In fact, it's prosecutorial misconduct. If this weren't a blatant kangaroo court, it would result in a mistrial and probable disbarment of the prosecutors involved. So the only way to possibly rehabilitate this trial is with a good showing from their star witness. How well did that go? Here's a hint. That's the next segment. So all of that makes Alvin Bragg this week's biggest bogon emitter. I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv. And now let's flabulate this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. I keep trying not to make these about the same stories, but when you have this enormous travesty and devastating bungle of an implosion that is the New York Trump trial, nothing else compares, and this time it's going to Michael Cohen. The closest I had for a runner-up was faith healer Benny Hinn, but he wasn't even close. But maybe I'll save him for next week. We've talked about the disgraced and disbarred Michael Cohen before. He was one of the ones who thought it was a good idea to write briefs with an AI, and it made up a bunch of fictional cases. Separately of that, he's been convicted of perjury, fraud, and a bunch of other charges, and was disbarred. And he's Alvin Bragg's star witness against Donald Trump. What could possibly go wrong? As with the Engoron trial, Trump's defense team caught him in all sorts of inconsistencies and forced him to backtrack on a lot of the claims he made on direct. A neutral and rational observer would have to conclude the guy was lying through his eye teeth. In fact, that was the opinion of several people in the news media, even if we just stick to CNN, which normally runs interference for anyone trying to go against Trump. They've been behind Stormy and Cohen all this time. Just take a listen to some of them. And yes, sorry, this is going to be another long one, so strap in. Let's start off with Anderson Cooper.
The last 20 minutes of court today, right before the lunch break, it was incredible. On a cross-examination, lawyers want to kind of build a box around the witness and then slam it shut. That's what Todd Blanche did to Michael Cohen. Todd Blanche just methodically went through this sequence of events of this phone conversation that Michael Cohen had testified to previously, that he had had this consequential phone conversation with Donald Trump. It was a 90-second phone conversation. But Todd Blanche, on his cross-examination today, kind of looked at the transcript of text messages that Michael Cohen had received and sent before that time frame. And there had been this series, I guess, of crank calls that Michael Cohen had received. It turned out to be from some 14-year-old. And then Michael Cohen texts Keith Schiller at like 7:50 something or 7:48 p.m. saying, hey, you know, I've got some dope has been harassing me. I got the person's phone number. Who can I talk to? Keith Schiller texts him back saying, call me, and Michael Cohen calls Keith Schiller. This is the conversation that previously Michael Cohen had said he was calling to speak to Donald Trump to tell him he was going ahead with the Stormy Daniels arrangement and that Trump approved it, which was crucial to Michael Cohen's whole raison d'etre for being on the stand. He's the only person testifying to direct involvement by Donald Trump in the Stormy Daniels payments. It was an extraordinary cross-examination by Todd Blanche, and throughout the day, Michael Cohen, when he found himself in a corner, he does have a pattern of suddenly not understanding the question that's being asked. But this time, Michael Cohen was cornered in what appeared to be a lie, I think, to many in the room, and had to adjust suddenly his memory that he had just testified to on Tuesday.
And in another segment, he said that if he were a juror, he'd have to acquit.
If I was a juror in this case, watching that, I would think this guy's making this up as he's going along. You know, Todd Blanche is pointing out, you were testifying just on Tuesday in this court. You know, and all morning long, he's been pointing out inconsistencies in Michael Cohen's testimony, or at least questionable aspects of Michael Cohen's testimony. Todd Blanche clearly saved this to right before the lunch break, I'm assuming, because it was just so well crafted. And just point by point walking through this story, which at first seemed, you know, why this seems like a ridiculous story. Some 14-year-old is sending him, you know, nasty text messages, and he's going to call Keith Schiller about it. And then you realize, you look at he showed the phone logs that the prosecutor had shown, and it's the phone call that Michael Cohen had previously talked about. I think it is severely damaging to Michael Cohen's testimony.
And here, Alyssa Farah Griffin, never any Trump fan, saying the same thing.
For me, even with my strong feelings about Donald Trump, my knowledge of how he behaves, I couldn't today convict beyond a reasonable doubt. Michael Cohen is just such a problematic figure. And in this own cross, I was just waiting to see somebody who was above board, didn't step in it, didn't lie, didn't end up getting kind of hostile and pushing back in some of these challenges. And it's hard for me to believe him when he's misrepresenting something as fundamental as having wanted a job in the White House.
So that brings us to the big part of this story. That Cohen's former attorney, Robert Costello, has come out and said that Cohen said a lot of things on the stand and under oath that he knew to be false. And by the way, if you're wondering about attorney-client privilege, Cohen waived that, and Costello has the paperwork showing that. Here's him testifying before the House Judiciary Committee.
Cohen decided that while he didn't believe the allegation of the Stormy Daniels story, that he thought the story would be embarrassing for Trump and especially for Melania, so he decided he would take care of it himself.
Absolutely. And that is contrary to what this guy testified to in court in New York yesterday.
Well, and what's not being talked about is your next paragraph, like the reason and his motivation for that. So if you could just kind of walk through that for the committee.
Yeah, obviously, when we started to talk about the NDAs, and this is the very first meeting at the Regency Hotel, when, by the way, Rudy Giuliani was not involved in representing Donald Trump at that time. Cohn testified that it was a conspiracy between Giuliani and Costello as of this date. Totally false. In any event, he also said that he didn't discuss the Stormy Daniels matter with us, and he certainly did. I specifically asked him because he kept on going back saying, I can't believe they're trying to put me in jail for these NDAs. So I said, Michael, tell me about the NDA. Tell me about Stormy Daniels. What did you do? He said, I got a call from a lawyer representing Stormy Daniels who represented that she was going to testify that Donald Trump had sex with Stormy Daniels. Michael Cohen said, I didn't believe the allegation, but I knew that such an allegation would be terribly embarrassing. He said it would be embarrassing. He focused on Melania Trump. He said, I didn't want to embarrass Melania Trump. He said, that's why I decided to take care of this on my own. Right. I went back to that several times. You did this on your own? On my own. Did Donald Trump have anything to do with it? No. Did you get the money from Donald Trump? No. From any of his organizations? No. From anybody connected to Donald Trump? No. Where did you get the money? I took out a HELOC loan against my property. I said, why would you do that? He said, I didn't want anybody to know where I got this money. I didn't want Melania to know. I didn't want my own wife to know because she's in charge, he said, of the Cohen family finances. He said if she saw money coming out of my account, she'd ask me 100 questions, and I didn't want to answer any of them.
So not just once, multiple times he told you that while you were his attorney, while you were in consultation with your client, he said that multiple times.
He not only said that multiple times, but he said that after I said to him, knowing that he was suicidal, Michael, think about this. Isn't it easier to cooperate against Donald Trump than it is to kill yourself? And he still said, I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything.
But when you laid it all out, you said, dude, you better cooperate. If you got something truthful on the president, you better let me have it or you're in trouble. And he came back with the exact same statement. I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything on Trump.
That is correct. And that was my obligation to do that, to fully inform him of what his escape route was, as he called it.
And then he changed his story, right? Then he went on TV and changed his story.
Exactly. He changed his story. He turned around, and he's the only one who can do that. You have to believe Michael Cohen in order to convict Donald Trump if there's actually a crime there, which there isn't. But I talked to 8 of his assistant DAs.
What was that reception like?
I gave them a Zoom conference interview for an hour and a half before I testified in the grand jury on Monday. And then on Monday, when I testified in the grand jury, they did everything in their power not to ask me the questions that would elicit the exculpatory information.
One more clip I think we need to hear from him, this time from Fox News.
One thing that you're not reporting yet is that besides making that statement, I swear to God, I don't have anything on Donald Trump, he also said more times than that answer, guys, I want you to understand, I will do whatever the F I have to do. I will never spend a day in jail. And then he'd slam his hand on the conference room table. And what does that mean to you? That means this guy is saying, I will lie, cheat, steal, do whatever I have to do. I'm not going to jail. Well, he did go to jail. And who do you think he blames for that? Mm-hmm. And why do you think he names his most recent book, Revenge? I mean, quite frankly, he's using this to monetize himself because this is the only way this guy can make money right now, selling books and T-shirts and trinkets and being the ultimate anti-Trumper. And because he was doing that on TV, and I saw that, I said, I can't sit by and let this guy tell the grand jury, tell the jurors now this false story when he told us the opposite story at a moment when he was desperately seeking a way out and was willing to kill himself. And certainly cooperating with truthful information is a lot easier. But he didn't have any truthful information.
You get the idea. There's a lot more, but I can't make the segment any longer than it is. But surely that's more than enough to make Michael Cohen this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this A Dandy and a Clown edition of the Bogosity Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at the Discord or at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Terry Goodkind. People are stupid. They can only rarely tell the difference between a lie and the truth, and yet they are confident they can, and so are all the easier to fool. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.